Careful what you wish for.
Well, okay. Thank you, John Harwood from Washington, D.C. We appreciate it. Now, we bring back Eliana Johnson of the National Review and Ed Conard from AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, are back with me. Ed, I read your Foreign Affairs magazine piece about America's growth and so forth. One of your biggest beefs is we spend too much money and we should cut spending. Is there a better example than this? I mean, is that possible?
I'm not going to defend this.
I mean, these are the tax collectors, and they're going to be the Obamacare collectors, and there they are doing goofy, wacky stuff in full public view?
Well, you know, individuals do wacky stuff, I suppose. You know, I think the spending issue is a big strategic issue. Maybe this is a tactical problem. We certainly need to address the tactical problems as well.
Yeah, we saw this with the GSA, though. Remember the GSA stuff? Same thing. I mean, some of this stuff is these guys are staying in the presidential suites, $1,500 a night, $3,500 a night. This is not small potatoes. This is arrogance. This is bureaucratic arrogance.
Well, I think when you don't have competition, spending gets out of control. We know that. Competition is what reins it in, I believe.
All right, Eliana, it's not necessarily germane to the targeting of conservative groups. I get that point. But this is its own issue, it seems to me. And we're now finding this all over the government, this bureaucratic, spendthrift arrogance where they think they're accountable to nobody.
Well, the point I think you've heard a lot of conservatives make, Larry, is that, and especially Tea Party groups, is that big government tends towards corruption. And that's the point you see make about the IRS scandal. That's the point you've heard them made about trusting the IRS with Obamacare, that it can't be trusted because this is what you get from big government. And I think the same point applies to the lavish spending on these conferences. And that's not limited to the IRS. As you mentioned, the GAO scandal. And, you know, a bizarre quirk of all of this seems to be that these groups really seem to have a penchant for music and dancing. We saw the GAO.
What is it with
we
them?
saw the GAO, you know, spend on line dancing, and we see the IRS doing the Cupid Shuffle and spending on guitars and violinists. Yeah, they must be calling it
People have a lot of pent-up something. I don't know what it is.
Must not
Or
play
they're
very
doing,
much
or they're on
music.
something, and I don't want to know anything about it. But there is just something bizarre. I don't know if these groups get together, the GSA and the IRS, and who knows if you have an S in your name. All right, but there are other important issues here. Well, let's talk about this. You guys stay with me. Democratic-heavy IRS. That's right. Democratic-heavy IRS. Always going to distrust the Tea Party. In fact, the whole bloody federal bureaucracy has taken 5 giant steps to the left in recent years. Here to talk about that now is Tim Carney, senior political analyst for the Washington Examiner. Tim Carney, your column here, the Democratic-heavy IRS will always distrust Tea Parties, is an absolutely brilliant column. Now, they give all their money to Democratic candidates. Is that what you found?
Well, overall, contributions I could trace to the IRS went something like 2-to-1 to Democrats. But if you focus in on the Cincinnati office, which was charged with, frankly, policing political speech of nonprofits, I found 75% of those donations went to Democrats over the last 3 cycles. Focusing just on last election, every penny I could trace to that office went to either Sherrod Brown, the liberal Democratic senator from Ohio, or to President Barack Obama.
How can these people, therefore, scrutinize conservative applications to tax-exempt funds? How is such a thing even remotely possible? Putting aside who's lying and who's not lying, the basic institutional bias here.
So I try to assume good intent by people and assume no conspiracy. We don't have evidence of a conspiracy. Imagine they're doing their best job possible. Their job is to say who's too political and who's actually a social welfare group. I got emails from angry IRS officials after my first column on them saying, how is it a social welfare pursuit to be a Tea Partier? These guys are just politics. They're trying to shrink government. They're trying to end my job. How is that social welfare? So you see a bunch of Democrats, union workers, surrounded only by Democratic union workers, and they're asked to say, who's actually pursuing social welfare? Of course there's going to be a bias, no matter how hard they try to overcome it.
But this is a 5th column all throughout the federal government. That's the point I'm looking at. This is not just limited to the IRS. All these unionized bureaucracies, I'm going to say, Tim, basically think the same way. Do they not? Am I being unfair?
Well, I'm not going to use the term fifth column, Larry, but I will say it is a special interest group that is charged with pursuing the public interest. So there's the problem. These guys do not want smaller government. They do not want the government to be able to have a stronger negotiating hand with the unions. They do not have the same interest in lower taxes that the average American does, because tax dollars are their bread and butter. So to have a special interest group, government worker unions, be a huge part of our bureaucracy, that's problematic. And you see it in the donations. The IRS guys, they're members of the National Treasury Employees Union. Something like 95% of that union's campaign contributions last election went to Democrats.
And one wonders about the relationship of Colleen Kelly, who runs that union, and all the goings-on in the IRS and maybe the White House. Eliana Johnson, you ever heard of a Republican union? A Republican public government union that might be fair? Is there such a thing? That's an oxymoron. No, it's just a stupid thing for me to say. Seriously, is there such a thing?
Well, I think Tim's column was really the column on this issue, and National Review did a similar study on the IRS more broadly, and found that in the last two elections, in 2008, IRS employees gave almost $50,000 to Barack Obama and about $1,950 to John McCain.
$1,950 versus 50 grand. Ed Conner, just tell me, as a citizen, as a businessman, what do you make of this and how to solve it?
Well, I guess I'm surprised that they aren't bending over backwards to try to avoid bias because of the appearance of bias that these kinds of statistics show. And this is a hotbed political issue, so you would think that lawyers would have been on top of this area, scrutinizing it, not only for the statistical averages, but just for the guidelines that are being used for these organizations, which were ballooning, mushrooming the money that was coming in, and they were trying to genuinely trying to sort through what's legitimate and not legitimate. So you think the lawyers are all over it, but you can't just make or conservative organizations the only test cases or the predominant test cases.
I think the problem that you have there is a problem that you had in larger news organizations in the 60s and the 50s, and that you still have with them today, is that their perception of fairness is to pursue Republican groups more doggedly. Because, and this is what one of Lois Lerner's former colleagues told me, Larry, is that she just thinks that Republican groups are more likely to skirt the laws.
Oh,
so
sure.
her perception of fairness is to pursue them, more, is to hold them to a higher standard, pursue them more strongly, that's fair to her.
Tim Carney, you think that these government employee unions who give all their money to Democrats are going to bend over backwards to be fair?
I think that if they, no matter how hard they try to be fair, and I try not to impute motives, no matter how hard they try to be fair, you are a bunch of Democrats surrounded only by Democrats, then you are in a bubble. And it is harder to see how these guys are really trying to pursue the public good. And it is easier to suspect, as Eliana's saying, that, well, maybe these Republican guys, maybe they are nastier. And you see that all the time these days, where liberal media critics are saying, let's stop being even-handed. Let's agree the right is nastier than the left.
All right, I got to get here. I'll tell you, this is one small but important reason why I believe, I put a column out on this last weekend, full-fledged tax reform and simplification would at least take some of their power away. Not all, but it would at least take some of their power, and all the cronyism and insiderism that you write about, Tim, let's curb that. Anyway, I got to get out of here. Tim Carney, great work. Eliana Johnson, National Review, thank you very much. Now, a serious question on our